Thank you very much. And a happy new year to everyone. I hope it's going to be a healthier year for everyone. I'm very excited to be invited to speak at this seminar in Bangkok, even if I'm not physically there. I spent a lot of time in Bangkok in the past. I was an exchange student at Mahidol University 10 years ago. So it has a very special place in my heart. And hopefully next time I can actually physically come to Bangkok to meet you all. But for now, we'll use the technologies that we have. So this lecture is going to be about my PhD research, which is about the intersection of human rights and world heritage. My PhD was an interdisciplinary project, and it draws on history, anthropology, sociology, international law, and political science. It was concerned with the extent to which the engagement with human rights can help to reconcile different agendas of conservation, religion, and development at the religious and historic site Bagan in Myanmar, for which at the time a World Heritage nomination was being prepared and several rights were at stake. Because if you look at the conservation of a place like Bagan through a human rights lens, this draws attention to some key areas of tension as the living heritage and the development pressures, because both could compromise conservation efforts and could be restricted for a World Heritage nomination. But a rights-based approach raises some difficult questions about the extent to which such restrictions are acceptable. My research was qualitative, and I did documentation analysis, interviews, and observation, and I spent 6 months in Myanmar in 2014 and 2015. So after my PhD, I worked as a teaching fellow at the Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage at the University of Birmingham for a few years. And the last year I worked also as a lecturer at the French University in Egypt. So just to give a little bit of a background about what I'm going to talk about, because my PhD research took place between 2013 and 2017. So it's a few years ago. A few very important events happened after this, and this includes the Bagan's inclusion on UNESCO's World Heritage List. This was in 2019. Then we had a COVID pandemic starting in 2020 and a military coup in last year in 2021. My research is not about these last 3 points. It took place earlier. So unfortunately, I cannot give any information about the current situation in Bagan. And things would have changed a lot already since the pandemic, with tourism having been a key factor in Bagan. That's stopped largely after the pandemic. And with the military coup, of course, the situation changed completely. And I have no information on this, unfortunately. So what I'm talking about is actually more what I've learned about the use of human rights in UNESCO's World Heritage System, using Bagan as a case study. And this is that briefly there are some key challenges to the use of human rights in World Heritage conservation. And these challenges, they're conceptual, political, and practical. And I'm going to explain them to you more during this lecture. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about is, first, I'm going to explain a little bit more what World Heritage and human rights, how they relate to each other, what do they have to do with each other. Then I'll provide a little bit more background about Bagan and Myanmar. Then I'll explain these conceptual, practical, and political challenges. And finally, I will go over the risks and opportunities of ambiguity, because my main conclusion here is that these challenges raise a lot of ambiguity about the use of human rights in this context. So World Heritage and human rights were long considered quite separate issues. So we saw the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, but actually it remained quite a marginal area in international law until maybe the 1990s. And the World Heritage Convention was created in 1972. So for those who don't exactly know what it is, in this convention, states parties, so countries, they can sign on to this convention. And if they do this, they promise that they're gonna create a list of sites in their state that they think are of outstanding universal value to humanity. Then they can prepare a whole document where they explain why they think it's of universal value and how they're going to protect it and how they're going to manage it and what its authenticity and integrity is. And then every year, a World Heritage Committee decides which properties are going to be included in this list. And it will evaluate existing properties, how they're going. What it doesn't do, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, UNESCO does not manage these sites. And in fact, after a World Heritage Site is included on a World Heritage List, it's still completely up to the state to protect the site or manage it or do with it whatever they want. UNESCO has no power to enforce anything. And also, there's not usually any money involved. Something on the World Heritage List doesn't get money because it's on the World Heritage List. So it's mainly a commitment by a state to protect or manage a site. And it's a recognition by the international community that it's a site of value. But the actual protection and management remains up to the state party. This is true also for human rights. If states sign to human rights conventions, they say, oh, we agree with these type of rights. We want to try to protect them. But whether or not they do in the end, the enforcement of that is extremely weak if it's at all existent. They were considered very separate because World Heritage initially was primarily also about material heritage, about buildings and archaeological sites, also flora and fauna, but not so much about humans. So the link with human rights wasn't very clear initially, and that only came a bit later. From about 2003, all UN entities adopted a statement of common understanding on human rights-based approaches. And UNESCO also adopted this statement, so they kind of committed to respect human rights in all their programs. What you saw after this, so from the 2000s, is that many UNESCO conventions and documents, they would start referring to human rights. They would say, we're in the context of this project, we will also support human rights. But it wasn't until 2015 that the UNESCO World Heritage Sustainable Development Policy was created. And this is specifically about World Heritage. In this policy, it stated that the full cycle of World Heritage processes, from nomination to management, needs to be compatible and supportive of human rights. So there is an official policy now that says that World Heritage needs to be supportive of human rights, but it's a very recent policy. But what do we mean when we talk about supporting human rights and heritage? And actually it already starts being a bit unclear here because there's many different ways to look at this link. One is to look at it through a perspective of international law. So some people take a very strictly legal approach, and they really look at what does the law say about rights and what does that mean in terms of what rights we have, where it should be enforced. But others take it as a more discursive way. So human rights in the context of heritage are also sometimes used to make claims or frame conflicts, regardless of what international law says. So this is more about what people think human rights should be, rather than what international law says. But there's quite a lot of work in that area too, both in academia and in advocacy and policy. There's also a difference between people who talk about a right to cultural heritage and those who talk about rights-based approaches. So if we talk about a right to cultural heritage, this is sort of a type of discussion or claim about whether we have a right to cultural heritage and, whether we should have a right to cultural heritage and what kind of cultural heritage. A critique of this is that there's actually several forms of cultural heritage that can be considered offensive or even in conflict with other human rights. So there's lots of debate on that. And rights-based approaches are more about, in the context of a heritage conservation project, we also want to make sure to protect all other categories of human rights. The weakness of this is that this will very likely lead to conflicting rights, about which I'll give some examples. And also that it raises some questions of scope, because where does this end? Another two different ways to look at human rights are as a type of philosophy, where people just, discuss, what are human rights, what should be a human right, what's not a human right. Are human rights universal? Are they the same everywhere in the world, or can they be culturally specific? Very philosophical sort of approach. And there's the politics of it. So actually, the international human rights regime is very much part of international politics in practice. So it is characterized with a lot of self-interest, pragmatism, and crisis management, and not so much a systemic implementation of principles. And we'll definitely get back to that as well, because I found in my research that this disagreements about the philosophy of rights and the politics of human rights are some key challenges to working with human rights in a World Heritage context. So at the time I did my research, Myanmar was a very interesting place to research this link between World Heritage and human rights. For decades, Myanmar was under a military dictatorship, and the military leaders of Myanmar were not very interested in kind of universalistic ideas about human rights or heritage. It had one of the worst human rights records of the world. And also in the 1990s and the 2000s, there was a lot of controversy about how the pagodas in Bagan were being conserved. But in 2011, there were many reforms that started, and there was a lot more engagement with the international community. This also culminated in elections that were won by the NLD of Aung San Suu Kyi. And part of these reforms were the establishment of a Human Rights Commission in 2011 and the inclusion eventually of two World Heritage Sites. The one was the Pew Ancient Cities, and in 2019 was Bagan. This made it a very interesting context to explore this dynamic between rights and heritage. Of course, since last year, things have changed dramatically in Myanmar, and where it's going to go in the future, I don't know. So Bagan was a kingdom of Myanmar between the 11th and the 13th centuries. And the kings of Bagan constructed over 4,000 pagodas on an area of around 100 square kilometers. And the purpose of building these pagodas was merit making. It's a Theravada Buddhist community, and they believe in a cycle of rebirth. And the best way to guarantee a good rebirth is through the collection of merit. And there are various ways in which one can collect merit, but the construction of Buddhist pagodas was considered to be a very effective way. Over 3,000 of these pagodas remain today. Some were largely abandoned, but others were still very active places of worship. For many people, Bagan is and always has been primarily a sacred site, and the buildings are Buddhist pagodas. But with the colonization of what was then known as Burma by the British in the 19th century, a new kind of understanding of these buildings was introduced, because the British, they saw them as historical monuments. And a historic monument or a pagoda, a religious building, might require a different way of engagement. Now, for decades, this did not really lead to any major conflicts, because religious activities and conservation or archaeological activities, they continued, but they remained quite modest. And this changed in the 1990s when the regime at the time, they started to lead a major renovation campaign of the monuments in Bagan, which was funded by donations of the public, which were sometimes substantial or sometimes modest, but these donations were motivated by merit making. Contributing to the maintenance of the government received new. Sometimes these paints obscured ancient murals. Stupas were regilded and new bricks replaced old ones. About over 1,000 monuments were even completely reconstructed, and 700 or so were partially rebuilt. And this work was criticized internationally because internationally accepted standards of conservation were not taken into account, and there was no reliable archaeological evidence for this type of work. And also the potential of future archaeological research was compromised by the way these reconstructions took place. The problem is that these international conservation standards do not necessarily represent local values or interests more than the questionable work of the former military regime. If anything, it represents them less. Many Buddhists actually supported this renovation of these temples as an important act of merit making. And a different perspective would suggest that the government at the time continued Myanmar's cultural practices, because reconstructions and renovations of pagodas by rulers of the country as means of merit making have been continuing through centuries. Just the scale was probably a lot larger this time. And conserving Buddhist monuments in a way that is considered internationally appropriate can even be considered an interruption of a form of intangible cultural heritage. So here's a key kind of conflict in Myanmar. But with the aim of a World Heritage status, the government approach to its heritage shifted. This is in the context of an engagement with the international community in many areas in Myanmar, including heritage, and reconstructions and renovations without evidence were no longer allowed, even if there was still some interest of Buddhists to do this. And a lot of the people that were involved with the preparation of the World Heritage nomination of Bagan were experts in technical matters such as archaeology and architecture, and didn't necessarily know a lot about the cultural or religious significance of these monuments. So there's different ways of understanding and valuing Bagan, which could lead to a conflict of interest. And important that there's a hierarchy of knowledge here, where the material focused understanding of these buildings as archaeology or heritage, it dominates in the World Heritage nomination. And in terms of human rights, there can be some implications of this. What I found to start with is that many people that were involved in Bagan's World Heritage nomination were not really sure what human rights have to do with Bagan, or they considered it beyond their technical mandates to engage with this language. And a big challenge is that if you're going to prioritize conservation of material over living heritage, you risk excluding people from their cultural and religious practices and possibly violate cultural or religious rights. But whether this is a cultural rights violation or not is not very clear. And that brings us to the first conceptual challenge. Because what is the meaning of cultural rights? The difficulty of cultural rights is that they can be interpreted in multiple ways. The meaning of cultural rights remains ambiguous and unclear, partly because the meaning of culture itself is. So I can demonstrate this by discussing 3 different conceptions of culture that have different implications for the meaning of cultural rights that were introduced by a sociologist named Rodolfo Stavenhagen. Because you could look at culture as capital, as something material, as monuments, as artifacts and art, as a product in a way. And according to this, a right to culture might mean a right of access by individuals to this type of product. So in Bagan, that might mean that brings the focus really to the monuments themselves rather than practices around that, really the tangible heritage. And then maybe a cultural right would mean that people have right to the conservation of the monuments, and religious practices should maybe be controlled or limited so they do not harm the actual monument. But according to a second conception, culture is creativity. It's a process of artistic and scientific creation. It's, in a way, it's a process. It's more of an intangible heritage. So then we can focus more on the processes of merit making can be considered heritage in itself. But the focus is still a little bit on the product. And the question is merit making a type of intangible heritage that we should protect? Do we have a right to this? Or do we have a right to conservation? And if culture is a way of life, this is more, the third conception is more of an anthropological understanding of culture, where it's the whole way of life of somebody's culture. And here, cultural rights refers to the maintenance and development of this specific culture. And then it becomes so broad that it's also very challenging to use in terms of World Heritage conservation. So different conceptions of culture and cultural rights make it a bit unclear what they refer to in the context of Bagan. Do people have cultural rights to the conservation of monuments that are like a product of cultural capital, of universal value to humanity? Or do people have cultural rights to engage with pagodas as sites of merit making and popular religious practices, even if this might have an adverse impact on archaeology and architecture? I feel like both of these approaches could be used to. You can use the language of cultural rights to support their causes. So this is not very clear. But let's say we agree about what it means. Let's say we think we know what cultural right means. Even then, we can easily find it being in conflict with other rights. Because if we're going to prioritize the conservation of heritage in Bagan, whether we focus on merit making or whether we focus on the conservation of archaeology, or we find a way to do both, it can be in conflict with economic land development rights. And this has been also a key area of tension in Bagan. Already back in 1990, there was a lot of controversy because the village of Old Bagan was relocated, supposedly in order to protect the heritage of that area. Forced relocations were very much, something that was being discussed during the World Heritage nomination of Bagan. So eventually what they concluded is that because in the whole area of Bagan, there's several villages among the monuments, as you can, on this picture is an example of that. And there's a few big hotels that also incorporate the monuments. And in the end, they agreed that some of these hotels would have to be relocated. And that the villages have to be relocated, not officially, but there might be some serious restrictions in their development, because if they're gonna, say build a big high rise next to the pagodas, it can be considered as not good for the conservation of the area. But whether relocations are a rights violation is also unclear, because it depends on many different things. According to domestic and international legal structures, eviction can be justified under certain conditions, specifically if it's for like a greater good or something. But morally, it remains very controversial. And it is still controversial in Bagan, because what you'll find is that people with the right connections and the right amount of money can resist being evicted, whereas people who are more vulnerable might lose their homes or have to be relocated against their will. But these things are always interpreted and weighed differently by different actors, because some people think maybe all housing and all developments should be removed from Bagan because it should be an area, an heritage area, an archaeological area, even a religious area, but it shouldn't be a residential area or a tourist area with many hotels. And others focus more on the people that live there and how they need to make a livelihood. They need to make a living. They've lived there maybe for generations, and it's not acceptable for them to be moved. So this is remains to be a conflict. So this is a conflict between the protection of heritage or cultural rights and land rights or development rights. And it's a very tricky one in an area where tourism was rising very rapidly before the pandemic and the coup. And there were lots of, people saw lots of potential there to maybe overcome poverty and stuff. At the moment, I don't think tourism is a big threat anymore for obvious reasons, but maybe in the future, it's still something they're going to have to revisit. Then, with these kind of conflicts, when we talk what is the cultural rights or how should it be balanced with development, it can be tempting to be like, let's ask the community. What does the community want here? And lots of heritage policies these days will focus on community participation, which is actually very important. But it is not very simple, because the question of who exactly is the community is not always, doesn't reach a straightforward answer. So I also learned in Bagan that the people there, and also Myanmar people in general, they are divided about what they think is the best way to manage Bagan. And that's because, of course, every individual has different interests. So some people, they disapproved of reconstructions and renovations, and others supported them. And there is, very importantly, there are hierarchies within the community also, where some people have more power and others have less power. And that also relates to the question of what does it mean? What is participation? There's often some sort of community participation efforts in World Heritage context, but it can take very different forms. Sometimes it's more an awareness raising campaign that they call community participation, but the community isn't asked anything. Sometimes they organize a type of meeting where the community members can express their views on certain issues, but then nothing is done with this information. It's just like a gesture more than that they actually take in the ideas of the community. And then one important thing I learned is also the way you organize a community participation event will determine who feels included and who doesn't. So I spoke, for example, in Bagan to an individual who was invited to a community participation workshop, but who decided not to go because he felt he's not going to be listened to anyway. And he said something like, if they really want to know what we think about this, why don't they come and sit in the tea shop and have a chat with us? So I think a community participation event can sometimes also be too formal or too much of a barrier for people to really express themselves, let alone whether people are going to listen to what they have to say. So it's community and participation is not always very easy here. So in terms of rights, you can ask who has rights and who has duties. And that's another difficult question, because is the duty bearer, like who's responsible for making sure rights are respected? Is that the Burmese government? Is that UNESCO? Or is it any other organization or individual that has an impact on World Heritage? And is it their duty to just refrain from rights violations themselves? Or is it their duty to include protection from violations by third parties? So again, all these things are not very clear. So we're moving on from these conceptual challenges to some political challenges. So until this government started this program of reforms in 2011, Myanmar's human rights record was among the worst in the world. And a recent and continuous history of accusations and denials, they make human rights quite a sensitive topic in Myanmar. And maybe too sensitive to use this language, maybe people don't want to use it, they feel uncomfortable with it. And that's not exclusive to Myanmar. In the whole of Southeast Asia, there is a bit of a reservation about the use of the international human rights regime. In the 1990s, there were even debates about whether Asian values are even compatible with universal human rights instruments. There's often, there's a fear that there's impingements on sovereignty, or that human rights are like a tool of Western imperialism. Sometimes they're seen as threatening unity or stability of a country. And that's not even limited to emerging economies necessarily. During my PhD, we had a roundtable with Australian heritage professionals to talk about rights-based approaches. And several people there also said that they thought using a different language than rights would be more effective in getting things done, even in a place like Australia. So it's politically something tricky to navigate. And then there's also the politicization of UNESCO's World Heritage Committee meetings. So who decides whether something is World Heritage, whether a site might have to go off the World Heritage list, or whether the current management of a property is going well or not? It's the World Heritage Committee. And this consists of 21 states that for 4 years make these type of decisions. And they get advice of a series of advisory bodies, but mostly this advice is these days not necessarily taken into account. It's more very political, this type of committee meeting, where different committee members, they will align with certain countries. They will make like negotiations, like I support your nomination, you support my nomination. There's lots of diplomacy and lobbying, and this official advice of experts is generally ignored. And we know many examples of this. And I think a very relevant, very recent example is the Thai example of Chiang National Park, which was included on the World Heritage list this year, even though there were actually explicit recommendations not to do so because of human rights issues in this park. It was included anyway, and that's very much because of politics. So it's UNESCO is an intergovernmental organization, and that's really limits what you can do with the type of language. Finally, some practical challenges. So besides this political sensitivity and these conceptual questions of what it means, there's the question of how do we reinforce human rights? Ideally, a human rights approach distinguishes itself because it has a focus on accountability. So it means, somebody who violates rights needs to be held accountable. But such methods of accountability are mostly non-existent, not only in Myanmar, but globally. In Myanmar, we see, things like corruption, lack of separation between the judiciary and the executive, a low administrative capacity, dysfunctional courts, alternative justice systems. And all of these things make it very hard to actually implement human rights-based policies. And but internationally, we don't get a lot of help. In fact, Myanmar's history shows that even if the international community condemns human rights violations, they don't have a lot of power to actually enforce change in any state. And, they tried lots of sanctions in Myanmar, but these are very controversial and it's very questionable whether they made a difference. And now we're talking about probably very serious human rights violations, not even about cultural rights in Bagan. So it's there's very little enforcement globally of rights, and locally when it comes to a low capacity of the state to enforce these type of policies. So even if we resolve political and conceptual questions, we run into some practical ones. So summary of everything I just said. There are some conceptual impediments or challenges around the meaning of certain categories of rights. Specifically, this is true for cultural rights, which is central in cultural heritage sites. What does this mean, cultural rights? How do we address conflicting rights? And you find that, again, this can be very central in a heritage site like Bagan, where you see that the right to culture, to conservation, can be in conflict with development rights, land rights, economic rights. And who even has these rights? Who is a community? How do you address inequalities in a community, and who is who has a duty to enforce these things? These are the conceptual challenges. As political challenges, we see there are we have to deal with the sensitivity of this language politically. So sometimes it's better just to use a different wording. And UNESCO is a intergovernmental organization, and the World Heritage Committee is definitely a committee that consists of politicians who are negotiating with each other about World Heritage. World Heritage is being a tool here. And then there are finally the practical challenges of enforcement and accountability. Even if we agree about about the conceptual things, how can we actually enforce human rights-based policy? So these are the key findings of my PhD, and that led me to feel like there's lots of ambiguity. These type of challenges, they show that there's lots of uncertainty about what does it mean to use human rights or implement rights-based approaches in World Heritage. And I think this type of uncertainty, we can look at it as a glass half full or a glass half empty. It has some risks, it has some opportunities. And more, it can leave this type of discourse of human rights open to change. It enables reflection, dialogue, or debate on whether and how this link between heritage and rights is appropriate or what it should mean, and that it's a bit open can be a good thing. On the other hand, that it's so uncertain and ambiguous can lead to sort of everybody saying we are doing human rights and sounding very moral and legitimate without actually fundamentally changing anything or challenging existing power relations. So then it's more rhetoric without responsibility. An optimistic assessment of all this sort of uncertainty of the usage of the emergence of human rights in World Heritage policy is that this kind of dynamic, at the very least, it shifts the focus in World Heritage conservation from things to people. So from ruins to rituals, from places to people. It's no longer just about archaeology or about architecture. It's about the livelihoods of people that are impacted. And I think a rights-based approach has the potential to highlight that and bring that forward. And I think that's something very valuable about the use of rights-based approaches. In the right policy document at the right place, maybe it can be a tool for empowerment. Maybe a certain community can point to a certain policy and be like, look, we're supposed to have rights here, and these need to be respected. Whether they will probably depend on the politics of the time, but at the right time, at the right place, maybe it can help. A more pessimistic assessment is that rights will always be interpreted in favor of those who are more powerful. And at the same time, there is no accountability or enforcement. So it's not very helpful that this language is adopted, because at the end of the day, politics are going to be more powerful than actual implementation of rights policies and heritage. So rights, so I think human rights in the context of World Heritage, as a concluding remark here, they have some potentially valuable insights in World Heritage conservation if you analyze the heritage sites through a human rights lens. But there will always be partial, and they will always be subject to certain limitations. And this is why I would argue, moving forward in heritage, we need some juxtaposition. So we need not to only focus on a rights-based approach, we need to look at other angles or other frames, maybe sustainability, maybe conflict resolution. Recently, there's talk of something called people-based approaches. And I think there's a lot of value in not looking at human rights as the final solution to things, because it has too many limitations, in my opinion, for that. So I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to talk about this today, and I welcome any questions.